Today we are talking about the early 1960s and the presidency of John F. Kennedy. So, when Kennedy ran in 1960, there were several things that made him a positive presidential candidate in a lot of people's eyes. He was very intelligent, Harvard educated, a very eloquent speaker, and seemed to have a very friendly personality, which is something that people look for in someone to vote for. He was also a soldier during World War II. He came from a very wealthy and famous family, so people knew his last name. He was also handsome and had a beautiful wife. That really shouldn't be a reason why people vote for people or like people, but we're human, and as the Bible says, men judge by the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart, and that's certainly true in American elections. So a lot of people voted for him because he looked like a president, and the television debates gave him a big advantage in that way. However, there were two factors that made John F. Kennedy a controversial candidate. Not a bad candidate, but just controversial in some people's eyes. One was because he was young. He was 43, which made him the second youngest president ever after Theodore Roosevelt. So he was seen as inexperienced and unprepared for the job. He was also Roman Catholic. Up until that point, we had never had a Roman Catholic president before, and there was a lot of anti Catholic sentiment in America at the time. A lot of people believed that his decisions as president would be controlled by the Pope. Now, one lie that Kennedy told on the campaign trail was called the missile gap accusation or the bomber gap accusation. And here he said that the Soviet Union was winning the arms race because their nuclear missiles outnumbered America's nuclear missiles. Now, in reality, the US actually outnumbered the USSR in missiles more than 100 to 1. But since JFK was such an eloquent speaker, the American people believed the missile gap accusation. And since Kennedy was running against the current vice president, Richard Nixon, this was seen as a condemnation of the current administration and therefore a condemnation of his opponent. And so people said, oh, we need someone new who can come in and help win the Cold War. There were also several voting irregularities in the 1960 election, including corruption in the political machine in Chicago. Chicago's mayor fraudulently provided JFK with 8,800 votes to carry Illinois. And due to this and some other factors, Kennedy narrowly defeated Vice President Richard Nixon. Now, during his inaugural address, JFK spoke only about foreign policy. He saw himself as a Cold War president. He believed it was his destiny to win the Cold War, and so for 15 to 20 minutes, he spoke only about American dominance in the global arena and how we will interact with other countries. However, the fact that he didn't mention any domestic issues, such as civil rights, disappointed many African Americans, including Martin Luther King, who had actually voted for John F. Kennedy and endorsed him in hopes that he would focus on the domestic issue of civil rights that was making a lot of progress, but still had a lot of work to do. Two quotes I think best summarize this very famous speech from 1961. First would be, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And then the second one is more of a symbolic quote. He said, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of the tiger ended up inside. And here he was talking about the Soviet Union as the tiger, the communist power in the world, and how so many people were trying to gain power by appeasing the tiger, appeasing the Soviets, and all that did was lead to their own destruction. Kennedy made another very famous speech a few months later, in which he said that we will land a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth by the end of this decade, being the 1960s. It's known as his moonshot speech, and it was made after the first American went up into space, Alan Shepard. Now, this was finally accomplished in July of 1969, but tragically, Kennedy did not live to see it happen. Now, in 1959, which was shortly before JFK's election, a crisis was occurring in the Caribbean. Cuba, which is very close to the United States, only about 90 miles from Florida, fell to communism. There was a big revolution in Cuba, and it fell to the totalitarian ruler, Fidel Castro. So this is a failure for the policy of containment, the idea that we should try to contain communism and not let it spread to other countries. Well, here it has spread not only to another country, but to a country in the Western Hemisphere, very close to the United States. And so the U.S. felt very threatened because of this. And really, during Kennedy's entire presidency, the two villains, I suppose, if you're casting a movie here and JFK is the hero, the two villains are going to be Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He had been since the mid 1950s, around when Joseph Stalin died. And then Fidel Castro was the dictator of communist Cuba. They were allies, and they were both anti-American radicals who were looking for a way to win the Cold War for the communists and bring about the world revolution. Now, because Castro was a threat, President Kennedy ordered the Bay of Pigs invasion on April 17th, 1961. Now, this was an invasion of Cuba. The goal here was to remove Fidel Castro from power by assassination and to overthrow the communist government of Cuba so that the communist threat would no longer be so close to our shores. The people who were trained to do this were Cubans who had fled from Cuba to flee Fidel's communist regime. They were then trained by the CIA and then carried out this operation. However, it was a total failure. The Cubans knew we were coming somehow, and over 1,000 of the invaders were taken prisoner. This embarrassment led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, what was that? The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the U.S. and the world ever came to nuclear war. These 13 days in October 1962 were when we were hanging on the precipice and almost experienced nuclear annihilation, in which case none of us would have been born. So Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union placed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. They said they did this for Cuba's protection because Cuba had been invaded by the U.S. a year and a half earlier. And they also did this in response to American missiles that were in Europe. And Russia essentially said, since American missiles are fairly close to our borders, then in fairness, we should have missiles close to their borders in case a war breaks out. And the location of Cuba made most of the U.S. vulnerable to attack. If you look at the map there, every major city in the U.S. except for Seattle was in the range of the longest range nuclear missiles that were placed on that island. So the U.S. saw this as a threat, in fact, as an act of war, and the president was told that the missiles would be operational. They would be assembled and operational within 2 weeks. And so JFK needed to act fast. And these 13 days that we call the Cuban Missile Crisis is known as the most dangerous moment in world history. So for 13 days, President Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, and several other people in his cabinet worked tirelessly. Some days didn't sleep at all in order to try to make negotiations with the Soviet Union in order to get the missiles out of Cuba. And there were several factors at play here. We didn't want to make the mistake of the Allies before World War II and appease the aggressor and say, oh, we'll do anything, just get them out. But at the same time, they had to get out, so we had to bend a little bit. And it was a really, really difficult situation for the president to navigate. Well, in the end, the USSR agreed to remove all missiles from Cuba in return for two things. Number one, the U.S. promised never to attack or invade Cuba again. Secondly, there was a secret agreement that once the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, 6 months later, the U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey, which was very close to the Russian border. Now, it had to be secret because this couldn't be seen as us like negotiating with terrorists. It couldn't be seen as us appeasing the Soviets and like, oh, they got what they wanted. All they had to do was threaten nuclear war. So it had to be secret, and the deal was that if the Soviets let this out, then the deal would be off and we would not remove our missiles from Turkey. But it worked. With this, the world was saved from possible annihilation. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis are both examples of small countries getting involved in the Cold War struggle between the world's two superpowers. And there were a lot of examples of this: Korea, Vietnam, Nicaragua, etc. Now, when the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, both superpowers had a moment where they said, wow, they had realized how close they had come to nuclear war and said, we need to enact measures to make sure that we never get this close to nuclear war ever again. So it caused them to establish the hotline, which was basically a phone that was connected from Washington to Moscow, in which the president could contact the Soviet leader at any time in order to hopefully diffuse crises. You also had the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which said we can no longer test nuclear missiles um, on land or in the water, but only underground. Another success of Kennedy's presidency was the creation of the Peace Corps. This was specifically created to provide support to underdeveloped nations around the world to help them achieve a higher standard of living. Now, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, the first year of Kennedy's presidency, and it was built on the border of East Berlin and West Berlin. Remember, West Berlin was inside East Germany, and therefore it was surrounded by communist territory. So the Soviets built this wall 90 miles around the city of West Berlin to keep people from going into West Berlin. So they were really trying to keep their people inside East Germany because so many thousands were going across the border into West Berlin because that's where freedom was. And so this wall became a sign of communist power and force and permanence, and it trapped thousands of people in communist East Berlin. It then became a symbol of the Cold War, and it was something that the U.S. believed needed to be torn down, which is why on June 28, 1963, JFK made a very famous speech in West Berlin, where he said, Ich bin ein Berliner, which is German for I am a Berliner, or a resident of Berlin. Now, this wasn't literally true, but in saying this, he proclaimed that as a free person, since West Berlin is the beacon of freedom in this world, he, in a sense, was a Berliner, and that he and America would stand with West Berlin, and that West Berlin would always be supported by the U.S., and we would not let it fall to communism. This was also a message aimed at the Soviets, that the U.S. would not let the Berlin Wall stop them in their support of freedom. So the Kennedy years experienced a lot of major events in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, and these 3 years in the early 1960s were very active. You have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, being formed in 1960 to organize young people in support of civil rights. In the 1960s, African Americans began to use the sit-in tactic in order to integrate restaurants, hotels, libraries, pools, transportation stations throughout the South. It's essentially when African Americans would go into a segregated place and sit where they were not allowed to sit and just sit there. They wouldn't try to agitate, they wouldn't chant or shout or use violence, they would just sit there knowing that they would probably be arrested, and in that way draw media attention to the injustice of segregation. These actions of Congress, the Supreme Court, as well as Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, gave the civil rights movement some of its first victories. You also had the work of nonviolent protesters that gave the civil rights movement its first victories. Now, progress was slow. It was steady. It was happening, but progress was slow. And because of that, in the 1960s, you have a growing impatience among many, especially many young people, that led to violent confrontations in the streets. Now, while Southern leaders were forced to accept integration of public schools, many were adamant to keep universities open to white students only. So, for example, in 1962, the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, barred a black student named James Meredith from entering the university. Meredith was the first black student to get accepted at Ole Miss, and the fact that the governor would not let him attend led to mob violence following because, according to federal law, the governor had to let him attend. But the governor was violating federal law, and so Meredith still attended, and you have a crisis occurring in Oxford, Mississippi. President Kennedy then responded to this crisis by sending 3,000 federal troops to Oxford to ensure that Meredith would be allowed in and not attacked. You have something similar happening in Alabama the very next year. Alabama's governor, George Wallace, promised segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. That was a famous line in his inaugural address. And in 1963, he carried out this promise. He infamously, you could say, stood at the entrance of the University of Alabama to prevent the entrance of two black students onto campus. And once again, John F. Kennedy had to send in troops to override what the governor was illegally doing so that the black students could be admitted to the university. Now, George Wallace remained very popular in Alabama. In fact, he ran for president in 1968 and won 5 states, 5 southern states, as you could guess. Now, he was actually shot the same year in an assassination attempt, but he survived, later changed his views on segregation. He then proceeded to win 4 elections and was governor of Alabama for 16 years. Now, the whole time, he remained enormously and really inexplicably popular. He even received 90% of the black vote in his last election. Medgar Evers is one of the heroes of the civil rights movement, especially for Mississippians. He was the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was also a World War II veteran and a college graduate, very intelligent, very courageous man, also a family man. And he was tragically killed in 1963 by a white supremacist KKK member. And he was killed actually in his own driveway. He was getting out of his car at night, coming home to see his family, and this coward from the bushes shot him in the back, and he bled out in the driveway while his wife and his 3 kids ran out to try to save him and couldn't. Now, this murderer was acquitted by an all-white jury in Mississippi, and it wasn't until 1994, 30 years later, that new evidence arose and was brought back to the court by a courageous lawyer named Bobby DeLauder, that Medgar Evers' family finally got justice when this man was finally put in prison and then died 7 years later. Now, Martin Luther King led a protest march when Medgar Evers was killed, even marched straight through Jackson. Then in 2004, Jackson changed the name of its airport to the Jackson Medgar Wiley Evers International Airport in honor of one of our state's greatest heroes. Recognized nationally as the leader of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King remained very committed to nonviolent protest against segregation. In 1963, he and his followers were jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, for what local authorities judged to be an illegal march. Now, the jailing of Dr. King was a milestone in the civil rights movement because most Americans knew who he was, liked him, and believed him to have been jailed unjustly. And from his jail cell, King wrote the essay "Letter from a Birmingham Jail," which has become very, very famous ever since. And in this letter, he wrote of his desire for Judeo-Christian values to, quote, bring our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers. So he essentially said, the founding of our country, the ideals that founded our country were great. The problem is we haven't lived up to those ideals, and we need to start living up to them for all Americans now. In August of 1963, King led one of the largest and most successful demonstrations in U.S. history. This is known as the March on Washington. The official name was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And at this march, approximately 200,000 people, both black and white, took part in this march. It was completely peaceful. And the highlight of the march was Dr. King's impassioned I Have a Dream speech, one of the greatest speeches in American history, in which he appealed for the end of racial prejudice, and he said that he longs for the day when people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He famously talked of a dream that he had that his children will hold hands with white children on the playground as sisters and brothers. and that little white boys and little white girls will play with little black boys and little black girls in one community. And it's such a beautiful image that some thought were impossible then. But every time I take my children to a playground or a park, I see that dream becoming a reality. So, John F. Kennedy's presidency was very eventful, but it was tragically cut short on November 22nd, 1963, when he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now, he had been in Dallas campaigning for his 1964 reelection bid. He was in the back seat of a convertible with his wife Jackie, parading through the city in a motorcade when he was shot. Now, Kennedy was the fourth U.S. president to be assassinated and the first and only president to be assassinated since the Secret Service had been established in 1901. Lee Harvey Oswald was a former sniper and a communist. He had spent time in the Soviet Union, had applied for Soviet citizenship, and he was virulently anti-American. Now, he shot the president from the sixth-story window of a building, the Texas School Book Depository, as his motorcade was going through the city. There were 3 shots. The governor of Texas, who was seated in front of the president, was shot but survived. President Kennedy was shot in the back, throat, and head, and he was declared dead at the hospital 30 minutes later. Now, Oswald ran from the scene of the crime. He encountered a police officer named J.D. Tippit and killed him too. The Dallas police caught up with Oswald in a movie theater and arrested him. Now, he denied both charges. You see him in the top picture there in handcuffs doing the communist power fist. But before he could be put on trial, he was shot. He was shot on his way from the police headquarters to the police car that would have taken him to prison. He was then rushed to the hospital, the same one where JFK had died in 48 hours earlier, and that is where Lee Harvey Oswald died. So JFK's death really changed the course of history. Global events like the Vietnam War and the Cold War may have turned out very differently if he had lived. Now, there are tons of conspiracy theories over Kennedy's death. Thousands of books have been written, but it's really fairly simple. Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. JFK was a Cold War president. He wanted to assassinate him, and that's really as simple as it needs to be. So this last slide I just thought you guys would find interesting. This is a portrait of the famous Kennedy family. In the middle back, you see John F. Kennedy when he was much younger, before he was president. I think this was taken in the 1930s. But there is a lot of mystery and tragedy involved in the Kennedy family. For example, Joseph Kennedy Jr., the oldest son, was killed in World War II. Of course, we know John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Then the third brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who had been John's attorney general, and then he was senator from New York, and he was also running for president in 1968 when he too was assassinated by a Palestinian who didn't like that he supported Israel. So of the 4 sons that the Kennedys had, 3 of them were killed, leaving only the youngest, Ted Kennedy, and he was kind of known as the black sheep of the family. And there was a time in 1969 where he killed a lady, involuntary vehicular manslaughter. He was driving home from a party, drunk, and there was a lady in his passenger seat. He ran his car into the lake, then he swam out of the lake, leaving her trapped in the car, and she suffocated in an air bubble over the course of 30 minutes down there. He then continued to get elected to the U.S. Senate for 40 years. People loved the Kennedys so much, they didn't really care that, their guy had killed a girl. And then John F. Kennedy's son, who was just a really little kid when his dad died, he too died at a very young age in 1999 in a car crash. So a lot of mystery and tragedy in the Kennedy family. All right, next video, we're going to focus on the rest of the 1960s, specifically during the presidency of Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson.